One discovery changed how we saw interpreting forever.
The things that you think you know about language are basically all wrong.
And it all began when a small group of researchers set out to understand what really happens when people who speak different languages work with interpreters.
What does it mean when you take this kind of interaction and you put in a third person?
I'm Jonathan Downey, this is Inside Interpreting from Integrity Languages, and that's the story we're going to tell today. We're also going to talk about what that discovery tells us about whether that app on your smartphone really can replace human interpreters. Oh, and by the way, this video has a sponsor. Find out more about that in the middle of this video. It's 1989 and a lot of things are going on. In Germany, some local people are partaking in a little bit of impromptu demolition. In music, some bangles are discovering an eternal flame. And somewhere in Washington DC, a revolution was beginning of a very different kind. This is Cynthia Roth.
How does that interaction work? And that's what led me to the basic question. One of the basic questions in human interaction is how do people take turns?
And this is Graham Turner.
There is no interpretation ever. There has never been an interpretation in the history of the planet that was perfect.
Though they were working thousands of miles apart and looking at interpreting in very different situations, they, alongside a Swedish researcher called Cecilia Wadensjö, and a few others who you'll meet as this video goes on, produced research which revolutionised how we saw interpreting. And it's research that is still causing ripples today. To understand what they discovered and why that matters, we'll need a short history lesson. You see, interpreting is old. It probably dates back to the first time that there were different languages. If you're, I don't know, trying to build a tower that reaches heaven, and you don't speak the same language as the person next to you, you'll need an interpreter. But precisely because interpreting involves spoken or sign languages, and precisely because it takes place while people are still speaking or signing, interpreting had tended to happen in the shadows. For years, thousands of years in fact, people didn't take much of an interest into how people managed to interpret, or even what it takes to be a good interpreter. Sure, there were guidelines here and there, but nothing that we would now call scientific. In the 1970s, cognitive psychologists began to take an interest. After all, what these people were doing, speaking and signing while seeing or hearing another language, went against what they thought they knew about the brain. One thing everyone agreed on was this: interpreting was about getting a message from one speaker to another. And any changes, any addition or omissions were seen as a fault. It didn't matter whether you saw this in terms of the sense above individual words, or even in terms of making sure that the same amount of information was in the interpreted version as was in the original. Interpreting was about passing a message from one person to another, with as few changes as possible.
And that was the ideology at that time within interpreting. When you go to conferences or workshops, people wanted to do that illusion of, I'm just doing this. I'm just passing your words back and forth, and of course you will all both instantly understand what the other means.
The fancy word for this is the conduit model. Back in 1989, Cynthia was realising that the conduit model was wrong.
The minute you do community interpreting, you know that doesn't work. It's not how that works. And so it was it's just an odd ideology. And then those aren't the problems that pop up.
But how do we know interpreting isn't just about passing a message from one person to another? During the interview Cynthia recorded for her PhD, something very strange and very important happened.
So I ended up doing a study of Deborah Tannen as the professor, Clayton Valley, a well-known, a graduate school colleague, a friend and colleague, and a young interpreter who was a child of deaf parents. And I videotaped them because they all agreed. At one point, the interpreter makes the deaf student pause. And that's because he knows that what she has to say is more important than what he has to say. And I interviewed both. I played that recording for both Deborah Tannen and the deaf student at Clayton Valley. And they both gave me insights. And one of the biggest insights was Clayton said, when I said, "What did you think when your interpreter told you to pause for a moment?" And he said, "I was delighted. I don't need to talk. She's the professor. I'm in there to learn from her. I want to hear what she has to say."
This wasn't the first time that Cynthia had realised that interpreting wasn't about passing information from one person to another. In fact,
I went to an interpreting assignment where there was an employer and an employee. The employee was deaf, the employer was hearing, and he was conducting a job interview. He clearly liked this employee. It was clearly like, this is pro forma. I'm just doing it because I have to. Anyway, the last question he asked was, "Why do you want this job?" And I interpreted it into ASL. And she answered, "It's better pay, better hours." And I knew right away that was the wrong answer. I knew that was not what he meant by that question. And so I've spent my career thinking about those sorts of indirect things that we know in English. The surface sentence says this, but the meaning is something completely different. So I was a young person and everything, but had I known, I would have interpreted that much differently.
as Cynthia's thesis and subsequent research were starting to become known outside of her own university, a book by another researcher, Susan Burke-Seligson, was making Graham realise that interpreting was far more complex than most people thought.
What tripped me into looking more closely at interpreting, or thinking more closely at about interpreting, in research terms anyway, was the work of Susan Burke-Seligson. So Burke-Seligson's Bilingual Courtroom book, from memory, is Chicago University Press, 1990, and won the British Association for Applied Linguistics annual book prize in the end of that academic year, so to speak. As the prize was awarded and the account was given as to what the book was about and why it was groundbreaking, I remember being in the audience thinking, I've got to get my hands on this book. The whole idea that is underpinning what Burke-Seligson is exploring about how the study of pragmatics and and ideas about implication and inference actually blow apart our thinking about interpretation in a courtroom or indeed any other kind of setting.
With Cynthia's research now becoming known, and Susan Burke-Seligson's book asking hard questions about what good interpreting might look like in courts, a foundation had been laid. Graham was keen to build on it.
I came back from that applied linguistics conference that I mentioned earlier, where Burke-Seligson's book was feted, and said to my line managers at the time, "Hey, this is really great work. We could do this with sign language and English interpreting rather than Burke-Seligson's work on Spanish-English interpreting in court settings. Why don't we put in a funding application for a project on this kind of topic?" Long and short of that was the funding was secured, and I was appointed as the principal researcher to that project when it began. Beginning to write about the ideas associated with that project took me to a Georgetown University Roundtable in Linguistics event. We ran a very small symposium within that event looking at sign language interpreting in legal settings. Marina McIntyre was involved. Judy Cagle was involved, and others from the sign language world at that time, primarily in the States. And a researcher beetled up to me after the end of that event And in my head, I think that was Cecilia. It might have been Cynthia. Either which way, whichever one it was, said to me, "You're only the second person I've heard talking in this kind of way about interaction and contextual specificity of meaning and interpreting and so on." If it was Cynthia, she said, "The other person I've heard is Cecilia." If it was Cecilia, she said, "The other person I've heard is Cynthia." But the point is, the three of us from that point on had been introduced, so to speak, to one another. Yeah, we had been made aware of one another's work.
There was now a small group of researchers taking ideas from sociolinguistics and applying them to interpreting. And they were finding time and time again that the conduit model just did not work. This was more than a minor disagreement between researchers of different camps. At that point, the dominant view was that interpreting was about carrying across meaning from one language to another with as few changes as possible. For researchers within the conduit model, meaning was something that a speaker created, the interpreters took, and then took over to the speakers of the other language. Cynthia had found that didn't work in sign language educational interpreting. Susan Burke-Seligson had found that that didn't work in spoken language court interpreting. Graham was fast showing that that was not working in sign language court interpreting either, and Cecilia Vadenshaw had already shown that that didn't work in spoken language public service interpreting. But if the conduit model is wrong, what do you replace it with? We'll answer that question after this short sponsor message. This video has a sponsor. Me. If you like learning more about interpreting and enjoy a laugh, I highly recommend my brand new book, Interpreting Wit. The link to buy it is in the description, and it talks about the kind of things that make interpreters laugh and shares some funny stories from my own career. Buy it now at the link in the description. And now, back to the video. Cynthia, Graham, Susan, and others had successfully shown that interpreting wasn't about carrying information from one language or one person to another. But if it wasn't about that, what was it about?
It doesn't matter what your language pair is. The process of interpreting, that human interaction of interpreting with this third person inserted, is what it's all about.
Now people saw it. Interpreting is about interaction. It's about people using their words to imply things, suggest things, even to show their emotions. The job interview that Cynthia interpreted early in her career is a great example.
The example I talked about before, that's an example of the conduit model breaking down, because the words, the surface words, are not what that question means. So I can't remember exactly the circumstances, but I've been in a place where both people start yelling at each other. And it's kind of like you're a referee. You have to tell both of them to stop, because you can't interpret two people at the same time.
But if interpreting is about people making meaning together, that means that anything that people do, can do, or are even trying to do can matter in interpreting.
So you can't produce an effective interpretation unless you are sensitive to the context in which it is being uttered. And by the context, I mean every single nuance of that context can possibly be a factor in determining meaning.
The strange thing is that somehow, interpreters already knew this, but they were discouraged from thinking that way because the conduit model was still so common.
I was mostly going to sign language interpreting conferences, and everyone was just very much on board, very much like, yes, this reflects our experience. And that was part of it for me as well, is I had these experiences that none of the conference interpreting research spoke to.
But when you do use the conduit model to try and figure out how good interpreters are, things go wrong quite quickly.
The research that wanted to talk about errors and miscues focused so much on all the mistakes interpreters made, and it got people depressed. And just like, oh, we're not doing a good job. And it wasn't until Jemina came along and proved that some of those omissions are strategic. They're done purposefully and that kind of thing. Oh, thank you, Jemina. For me, that was her huge contribution to that kind of, assessment of interpreting performance.
But why does it matter that interpreters aren't conduits? Why should anyone care about this stuff anyway? Well, the first and most obvious is that if you're an interpreter, you really should be taking note of the fact that you need to interpret in a way that makes sense and is appropriate for the context that you're in.
Contextually sensitive interpreting is real interpreting from my point of view. And that entails an awareness that anything can happen, that anything can matter at any moment in the interpretation, which is another way also of saying everything matters at all moments.
For everyone else, I'll leave you with this. If interpreting really is about humans interacting and making meaning together, that means there are hard limits as to what machines or that app on your phone can do. Sure, a phone app can tell you how to order a pizza with pineapple on it in Italy, but a human interpreter knows that's a bad idea and what to do about it. I'm Jonathan Downey, and this is Inside Interpreting from Integrity Languages.